The Empire of Japan would continue fighting for 3 more years, demonstrating remarkable resilience and tactical skill in countless engagements, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. But they would never again possess the strategic initiative or the naval aviation superiority that had made their early conquests possible. At Midway, the rising sun of Japanese naval power reached its zenith and began its irreversible descent toward the darkness of total defeat. The report grew more ominous when the same pilot clarified at 0820 hours. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. Nagumo's worst nightmare was materializing. American carriers were not only present, but positioned to strike while his flight decks were cluttered with refueling aircraft and scattered ordnance. Panic spread through the Japanese command hierarchy. Nagumo's staff officer, Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, urged immediate action against the American fleet. But the admiral faced an impossible dilemma. His first Midway strike was returning low on fuel. His remaining aircraft were armed for ground attack, and rearming would take precious time, while American bombers might already be approaching. At 0837 hours, Nagumo made another fateful decision. Reversing his earlier order, prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not as yet been changed to bombs. This compromise satisfied no one and left the Japanese in maximum vulnerability. Some aircraft armed for ships, others for land targets, all while the flight decks remained congested. With returning Midway attackers, the great irony was now unfolding. Across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean, both fleets were launching simultaneous strikes, each hunting the other in a deadly game of maritime hide-and-seek. But while American intelligence knew exactly where to find their targets, the Japanese were groping blind, their reconnaissance failures about to exact the ultimate price for an empire built on surprise attacks and perfect timing. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron adjusted his goggles and checked his fuel gauge one final time. As Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet, from his cockpit in the lead Douglas Devastator, the 38-year-old pilot could see the most magnificent and terrifying sight in naval warfare. For massive aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, surrounded by a protective screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Waldron had disobeyed direct orders to reach this moment, when the strike coordinator from Enterprise had led the main attack group on a southwestern heading. Waldron had broken formation, leading his 15 torpedo bombers on a more westerly course based on his own navigation calculations. His instincts honed through years of flying over the vast Pacific had proven correct. Now his squadron faced the Japanese fleet alone, without fighter escort or dive bomber support. The mathematics of aerial torpedo attack were brutally simple and heavily favored the defender. Devastator torpedo bombers had to approach low and slow, maintaining straight and level flight for several precious minutes while enemy fighters dove from above and anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship. The Mark 13 torpedo, America's primary aerial weapon, was notoriously unreliable, often running to deep or failing to explode even when it struck its target. But Waldron had volunteered for this mission knowing the odds. At the final briefing, he had told his men, if there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. Now, approaching the Japanese carriers at 0920 hours, those words carried the weight of prophecy. The Japanese response was swift and overwhelming. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served aboard Akagi as an observer, watched in amazement as American torpedo planes pressed their attack despite impossible odds. Zero fighters dove from high altitude while every ship in the formation opened fire, creating a wall of steel and flame that no aircraft should have survived. One by one, the devastators began falling into the Pacific. Waldron's own aircraft, hit repeatedly by cannon fire, began smoking and losing altitude. His last radio transmission crackled through the static. Watch those fighters. See that splash? Stay low. Moments later, his Devastator cartwheeled into the sea, taking with it one of the Navy's most experienced torpedo pilots. The slaughter continued as the surviving American aircraft pressed their attack. Within 15 minutes, all 15 Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 had been shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived the crash and would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, witnessing the battle's climax from a life raft amid the wreckage of his squadron. The attacks from Enterprise and Yorktown's torpedo squadrons met similar fates. Of 41 American torpedo planes that found the Japanese fleet, that morning, 35 were destroyed without scoring a single hit. The sacrifice seemed meaningless, brave men dying in obsolete aircraft armed with defective weapons against the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Yet their sacrifice achieved something beyond their wildest hopes, as Zero fighters dove to sea level to massacre the torpedo planes. And as every Japanese sailor and officer watched the spectacular aerial battle unfolding, just above the waves, no one was looking up. High above the smoke and chaos, invisible against the bright morning sky, American dive bombers were beginning their final approach. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's official Navy history, the Two-Ocean War, this moment represented the pivot point of the entire Pacific conflict, not just the Battle of Midway, but the ultimate outcome of World War II itself. The torpedo squadron's sacrifice had unwittingly set the stage for one of the most decisive tactical surprises in military history. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had been flying for over 2 hours, his fuel gauge dropping toward the point of no return when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast across the empty Pacific. The Enterprise Air Group commander faced the pilot's ultimate nightmare: find his target soon, or watch his entire strike force splash into the ocean when their tanks ran dry. Following his instincts, McCluskey turned to follow the destroyer's wake, gambling that it was racing to rejoin the main fleet. His decision, born from desperation rather than tactical brilliance, would change the course of world history. 20 minutes later, at 10:22 hours, the most powerful naval force ever assembled by the Empire of Japan appeared below, like a formation of toy ships on a blue carpet dot from 15,000 feet. The 4 Japanese carriers looked serene and untouchable. Flight decks crowded with aircraft reflected the morning sun like mirrors, while the screening ships steamed in perfect formation around their precious charges. Admiral Nagumo's combined fleet had dominated every engagement for 6 months, and, from this height, it appeared as invincible as ever. But appearances were fatally deceiving. Below decks, Japanese ordnance crews were racing to complete the rearming process that had been interrupted multiple times by contradictory orders. Fuel lines snaked across hangar decks while torpedoes, bombs, and ammunition sat exposed in neat rows. The world's most advanced aircraft carriers had become floating ammunition dumps, waiting for the spark that would consume them. McCluskey deployed his dive bombers in textbook formation, splitting his force between the 2 nearest carriers. He selected Kaga, the massive converted battleship, as his primary target, while Lieutenant Richard Best led a second section toward Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. At 10:24 hours, both sections rolled into their dives simultaneously, creating the most concentrated attack in carrier warfare history. The first bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, struck Akagi's flight deck near the island superstructure. The 1,000-pound warhead penetrated the wooden deck and exploded in the upper hangar, where armed and fueled aircraft were packed together awaiting launch. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited, turning the pride of the Imperial Navy into a raging inferno within minutes. Simultaneously, McCluskey's bombers found their mark on Kaga. 3 direct hits in rapid succession transformed the carrier into a floating crematorium. The first bomb detonated among spotted aircraft on the flight deck. The second penetrated to the hangar deck where it triggered massive fuel fires. And the third struck near the island, killing most of the ship's senior officers instantly. As Enterprise's dive bombers pulled out of their attack, Yorktown's aircraft arrived at the perfect moment to complete the destruction. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led his bombers against Soryu, the newest and fastest of Nagumo's carriers. Within 4 minutes from 10:24 to 10:28 hours, 3 of Japan's fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks collapsing as internal explosions gutted their hulls. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese combined fleet had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, conquering territory from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Now, Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled for fleet carriers. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers all aimed at the tiny atoll of Midway. The plan seemed flawless on paper. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had devised Operation Me as the decisive blow that would force America to negotiate peace. Midway would fall, drawing the remnants of the Pacific Fleet into a trap where Japanese superiority would crush them. Once and for all, what could go wrong for the force that had humiliated the Royal Navy at Ceylon and dominated every engagement since Pearl Harbor? Everything, as it turned out. The first critical failure had already occurred, though Nagumo didn't know it yet. Japanese naval codes, which had been partially broken by Allied cryptographers, had revealed the entire operation to Admiral Chester Nimitz weeks earlier. While Japanese planners believed they held the element of surprise, 3 American aircraft, carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown already lay in ambush northeast of Midway, positioned by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort's brilliant code-breaking team. But the intelligence failure ran deeper than broken codes. Japanese reconnaissance had consistently underestimated American strength and resolve. Their pilots reported sinking the carrier Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. Yet the damaged vessel had been repaired in a miraculous 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, and now awaited them at Midway. This phantom ship would soon play a crucial role in Japan's downfall. As dawn approached, Nagumo faced his first tactical dilemma, one that would expose the fundamental weakness in Japanese planning. His orders were contradictory: neutralize Midway's defenses, while simultaneously remaining ready to engage the American fleet. The Japanese had never properly coordinated a simultaneous land and sea operation of this complexity. Their doctrine excelled at single-objective naval battles, not the multi-layered campaign Yamamoto had envisioned. At 0 for 30 hours, Nagumo launched his first strike 108 aircraft toward Midway's installations, but he held back his best anti-ship weapons, the deadly Type 91 torpedoes, gambling that no American carriers lurked nearby. This decision, born from incomplete intelligence and overconfidence, would prove catastrophic. The rising sun painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, colors that seemed ominous to superstitious sailors who knew the old saying, "Red sky at morning, sailor take warning." As Nagumo's strike force disappeared toward Midway's distant reefs, the admiral couldn't know that American dive bombers were already warming their engines, just 200 miles away, preparing to deliver the most devastating surprise attack in naval history. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort had barely slept in weeks. Deep beneath Pearl Harbor's naval headquarters, his team of cryptographers worked around the clock in what they called the dungeon, a basement complex where America's most secret weapon operated 24 hours a day. Unlike the massive guns and aircraft that dominated headlines, Rochefort's weapon was information, and it had already won the battle. Before a single shot was fired, the breakthrough had come through painstaking detective work. Japanese naval code JN-25 had been partially cracked months earlier, but the enemy had introduced new encryption layers after Doolittle's raid on Tokyo in April. Rochefort's team had identified frequent references to AF and intercepted messages, clearly a major target requiring massive resources. Through an ingenious deception, they had confirmed AF meant Midway by having the garrison send false reports of fresh water shortages when Japanese intercepts mentioned AF's water problems. The puzzle was solved. Admiral Chester Nimitz had gambled everything on Rochefort's intelligence, with only 3 operational carriers against Japan's 4. Conventional wisdom suggested defending Pearl Harbor and the West Coast. Instead, Nimitz positioned his entire available fleet north of Midway, placing Admiral Raymond Spruance in tactical command aboard Enterprise, while Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded from the hastily repaired Yorktown Dot as dawn broke on June 4th. American radar operators on Midway detected incoming aircraft at 05:53 hours. The tiny garrison, barely 3,000 Marines and Navy personnel, prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. Major Floyd Parks, commanding Midway's air defenses, launched every available fighter, 26 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and 6 Grumman Wildcats against over 100 Japanese attackers. The aerial battle above Midway was brutally one-sided. The Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros, flown by veteran pilots with years of combat experience, decimated the American fighters. Within 30 minutes, 15 American aircraft were destroyed, with most of the remainder damaged. The Buffaloes, nicknamed Flying Coffins by their pilots, proved hopelessly outmatched against the agile Zeros. But Midway's sacrifice served a crucial purpose. As Japanese bombers pounded the atoll's installations, they discovered that the garrison remained operational. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike, radioed back to Admiral Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack wave." This message would trigger the fatal series of decisions that doomed the Japanese fleet. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, this moment represented the campaign's crucial turning point, not the later dive bomber attacks that captured popular imagination, but Nagumo's decision to prepare for a second land bombardment. Rather than maintaining anti-ship readiness aboard Akagi, Nagumo faced an impossible choice. His remaining aircraft were armed with land attack bombs and fragmentation weapons, useless against warships. Rearming with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes would take over an hour time. He might not have if American carriers appeared. Yet, Tomonaga's report suggested Midway required another devastating blow to ensure the invasion's success. At 07:15 hours, Nagumo made his fatal decision: prepare to carry out second attack on Midway. Below decks, ordnance crews began the dangerous process of switching munitions while fuel lines snaked across. Hangar decks, the combined fleet's most powerful weapons, became floating bombs, awaiting the spark that would consume them. The message crackled through Enterprise's radio room at 08:34 hours. Many planes heading Midway bearing 320 distance 150. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from Enterprise's Flag Bridge, knew this was the moment of truth. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was finally within reach. Spruance faced a commander's nightmare, attacking an enemy whose exact position remained unknown while his own location stayed secret. Conservative doctrine suggested waiting for better reconnaissance, but aggressive action might catch the Japanese while their aircraft recovered from the Midway strike. At 39 years old, Spruance was among the youngest admirals in the Pacific. Promoted after Admiral William Bull Halsey fell ill just days before the battle, now he would prove whether rapid advancement reflected brilliance or desperation. The decision came down to mathematics and intuition. If Japanese carriers lay 175 miles southwest the estimated distance, based on the Midway attacks timing, American dive bombers flying at maximum range might catch them during their most vulnerable moment, aircraft landing, refueling, and rearming. Miss this opportunity, and the Japanese might escape or, worse, locate the American fleet first. At 07:02 hours, Spruance gave the order that would change naval history: launch all available aircraft. Within minutes, Enterprise and Hornet began the largest carrier strike in American history to that point. 54 dive bombers, 29 torpedo planes, and 20 fighters roared into the morning sky, followed shortly by Yorktown's smaller but equally determined air group. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was receiving increasingly troubling reports. At 07:28 hours, a reconnaissance seaplane from the cruiser Tone reported 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 distance 240 miles from Midway. The message sent shockwaves through the combined fleets. Command structure: American ships, possibly including carriers, were exactly where they shouldn't be according to Japanese intelligence estimates. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical damage. Japanese sailors, who had witnessed 6 months of uninterrupted victory, watched in stunned disbelief as their most powerful warships died before their eyes. Admiral Nagumo evacuated from the blazing Akagi, transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, and tried desperately to maintain command of a fleet that no longer existed. Only Hiryu, steaming separately from the main formation, escaped the initial American attack. Captain Tomio Kaku immediately launched a desperate counterattack with his remaining aircraft, determined to salvage something from the disaster. But with 3/4 of his carrier strength eliminated in 4 minutes, Nagumo's offensive power was broken beyond repair. The torpedo squadron's earlier sacrifice now revealed its true value. By drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and focusing all attention on the low-altitude attack, they had created the perfect conditions for the dive bombers' surprise assault. What appeared to be a tactical failure had become the setup for the most decisive naval victory in American history. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge, watching smoke columns rise from his 3 sister ships on the horizon. As the sole surviving Japanese carrier, his ship now bore the weight of an empire's hopes. The battle was far from over, and Kaku intended to prove that the Imperial Navy could still strike back with devastating effect. At 1100 hours, Kaku launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, every operational aircraft aboard Hiryu. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike, following the American planes' return course toward their carriers. For the Japanese, this represented more than revenge. It was their last chance to salvage victory from catastrophic defeat. The American fleet, celebrating their morning triumph, was caught partially unprepared. Yorktown had recovered her aircraft and was refueling when radar operators detected incoming Japanese planes at 13:55 hours. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding from Yorktown's bridge, had barely enough time to launch 4 Wildcat fighters before the enemy arrived overhead. Kobayashi's dive bombers attacked with the precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck near the island, penetrating to the gallery deck where it exploded among parked aircraft. A second hit ruptured the ship's smokestack and damaged several boiler uptakes, reducing speed and creating dense black smoke that billowed across the Pacific. But American damage control proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within an hour, Yorktown's engineering crews had restored power and cleared the smoke from her stacks. By 1400 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and appeared ready to resume flight operations. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots circling high above, she looked like a different ship entirely, leading them to report that they had damaged 1 carrier, while another remained untouched. This crucial intelligence failure prompted Kaku to launch his second and final strike. 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway and recommended a second strike. Tomonaga knew his aircraft lacked sufficient fuel to return to Hiryu, but he accepted the suicide mission without hesitation. At approximately 1500 hours, Tomonaga's torpedo planes approached Yorktown from multiple angles in a perfectly coordinated attack. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down several attackers, but 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and leaving her dead in the water. This time, the damage was beyond immediate repair. Admiral Fletcher, recognizing that his flagship was doomed, transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria and passed tactical command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. The decision reflected American naval doctrine at its finest. Commanders who prioritized mission success over personal glory or ship preservation. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles away, still believed the operation could be salvaged. Despite losing 3 carriers, he ordered his surface ships to continue toward Midway for a nighttime bombardment, hoping to achieve the original objective through different means. But Spruance, now commanding the American task force, had already positioned his remaining carriers for the decisive blow. Enterprise and Hornet began preparing their final strike against Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier still capable of offensive operations. Intelligence reports confirmed the enemy ship's position, and American dive bombers were already arming for what they knew would be the battle's climactic engagement. The afternoon's exchanges had proven that Japanese spirit and skill remained formidable, even in defeat, but with overwhelming material losses and no possibility of reinforcement. Their tactical successes could not alter the strategic reality. The combined fleet that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was dying in the waters around a tiny atoll most Americans had never heard of until that morning. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher rolled his dauntless dive bomber into its final approach as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific. Below him, the Japanese carrier Hiryu steamed alone, abandoned by her escorts, a solitary survivor of the morning's catastrophe. At 1700 hours on June 4, 1942, the last act of the Battle of Midway was about to unfold. The attack on Hiryu was methodical and merciless. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Gallagher and supplemented by aircraft from the damaged Yorktown, descended in perfect formation. The Japanese ship, stripped of most her fighter protection, could only endure the inevitable, for direct hits in rapid succession transformed Hiryu into a blazing wreck, her flight deck cracking and collapsing as internal explosions gutted her hull. Captain Kaku, mortally wounded but still commanding from his bridge, ordered all hands to abandon ship as flames consumed the last operational Japanese carrier. The Empire's 6-month reign of Pacific dominance officially ended. From Pearl Harbor to Java Sea, from Darwin to Ceylon, Japanese naval aviation had seemed invincible. Now, in a single day, for fleet carriers and over 300 aircraft had been destroyed. Along with many of Japan's most experienced pilots, Admiral Nagumo, transferred to the light cruiser Nagara, faced the most difficult decision of his career. With his entire carrier force eliminated, continuing the Midway operation was impossible. At 25 minutes past midnight on June 5th, he finally ordered a general retreat, officially ending Operation Me in complete failure. But Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from the super battleship Yamato, initially refused to accept defeat. The architect of Pearl Harbor desperately sought ways to salvage victory from disaster. His massive surface fleet, including 11 battleships and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, still possessed overwhelming firepower for a night engagement. Perhaps they could crush the American fleet in a traditional gunnery duel, proving that battleships remained superior to carriers. The plan was tactically sound but strategically meaningless. Even if Yamamoto's battleships destroyed Spruance's task force, they could not replace the lost carriers or their irreplaceable aircrews. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was broken beyond repair. At 0 to 55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto finally acknowledged reality and ordered the entire combined fleet to withdraw. The human cost was staggering but asymmetrical. Japan lost approximately 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many veterans who could never be replaced given the compressed training schedules war demanded. America lost 307 men, primarily from the torpedo squadrons that sacrificed themselves to create the conditions for victory. Among the American dead was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, whose torpedo squadron A had been annihilated in the morning's first attack. His body was never recovered, but his tactical instincts in finding the Japanese fleet had made possible everything that followed. The sacrifice of his squadron and others like it became legend, symbolizing the courage that transformed America from a victim of surprise attack to master of the Pacific. The strategic implications were immediate and permanent. Japan's capacity to conduct offensive carrier operations was crippled for the remainder of the war. While they would build new ships and train new pilots, the veterans lost at Midway, men with years of combat experience from China to Pearl Harbor, could never be replaced within the time constraints of global war. As dawn broke on June 5th, the waters around Midway were littered with debris from what naval historians would call the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. The tiny atoll remained in American hands, its garrison battered but victorious. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered forever. Admiral Nimitz's final assessment, delivered to the press weeks later after security restrictions lifted, captured the battle's significance with characteristic understatement. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. In reality, Midway represented far more than revenge. It was the turning point that transformed the Pacific War from a defensive struggle for survival into an offensive campaign for total victory.